King Adebowale, the Greedy Glutton of Ife. In the ancient city of Ife, there lived a king named Adebowale. Now, Adebowale was not your ordinary king. Oh no, he was as round as a barrel and as tall as a short tree. His belly was so big, it entered the room before he did. When he walked, the ground shook, and when he sat on his throne, it creaked and groaned like an old man's bones. But Adebowale's size was not his biggest problem. You see, this king had a heart as small as a pebble and as hard as a rock. He cared only for himself and his endless appetite. While his people worked hard in the farms and markets, King Adebowale spent his days feasting and growing fatter. Every morning he would wake up and shout, "Bring me food." And the poor palace cooks would rush to prepare a feast fit for 10 men. But it was never enough for Adebowale. He would eat and eat until his clothes strained at the seams, and then he would eat some more. One day, a young boy named Tewo came to the palace. Tewo's family was very poor, and they had not eaten for days. With tears in his eyes, Tewo knelt before the king and begged, "O great King Adebowale, please help us. We have no food, and my little sisters are crying from hunger." Now you would think a king would help his people, right? But not Adebowale. He looked at the skinny boy and laughed so hard his fat cheeks jiggled like jelly. "Go away, you little rat," he bellowed. "If you're hungry, eat grass like the goats." Poor Tewo ran from the palace, his heart heavy with sadness. But as he left, an old woman stopped him. She was bent with age, her skin wrinkled like dried leaves, but her eyes sparkled with wisdom. "Don't cry, young one," she said softly. "The gods are watching, and they do not like what they see." Meanwhile, back in the palace, Adebowale was stuffing his face with pounded yam and egusi soup. He ate so much that his servants had to roll him to his bed like a giant ball. As he lay there, his stomach bulging like a pregnant woman's, he burped loudly and fell into a deep sleep. But this was no ordinary sleep. In his dreams, Adebowale found himself standing before the great god Oladume. The god's eyes flashed like lightning, and his voice rumbled like thunder. "Adebowale," he boomed, "you have forgotten your duty as a king. You feast while your people starve. You mock the hungry instead of helping them. It is time you learned a lesson." Adebowale trembled in fear. "Please, great Oladume," he whimpered, "I'll do better, I promise." But Oladume was not in a forgiving mood. With a wave of his hand he declared, "For 9 moons, you shall carry the burden of your greed. You will know the pain of hunger, the discomfort of a growing belly, and the struggle of those you have ignored. Only then may you learn compassion." With a start, Adebowale woke up. At first he thought it was just a bad dream from eating too much. But as he tried to sit up, he noticed something strange. His belly felt different. It was rounder, firmer, and when he pressed it he felt a strange fluttering inside. "No," he whispered in horror. "It can't be." But it was. King Adebowale, the Greedy Glutton of Ife, was pregnant. When the servants came to dress the king, they found him wailing like a baby, his hands clutching his swollen belly. The royal doctor was called, but he was as confused as everyone else. "I've never seen anything like it," he muttered, scratching his head. "It seems our king is with child." The news spread through Ife like wildfire. People gathered in the streets, whispering and wondering. Some laughed, some were scared, and some thought it was a sign from the gods. But no one was more surprised than Adebowale himself. At first he tried to hide his condition. He wore loose robes and stayed in his chambers. But as the days passed, his belly grew bigger and bigger. Soon it was impossible to hide. The king who once strutted around like a proud rooster now waddled like a pregnant duck. But the real challenge was yet to come. Adebowale was used to eating whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. But now everything made him sick. The smell of his favorite foods turned his stomach. He craved strange things like unripe mangoes and clay from the riverbank. Worst of all, he was always hungry, but he couldn't eat much. For the first time in his life, Adebowale knew what it felt like to go to bed with an empty stomach. He tossed and turned, unable to sleep, his mind filled with thoughts of food. As the moons passed, Adebowale's body changed in ways he never imagined. His feet swelled, his back ached, and he felt tired all the time. He who once mocked a hungry child now found himself weeping over a half-eaten bowl of soup. But something else was changing too. As Adebowale struggled with his strange condition, he began to see his kingdom with new eyes. He noticed the thin faces of the children in the streets, the tired eyes of the women in the market. For the first time, he felt a twinge of guilt. One day, as he sat in the palace courtyard, rubbing his aching back, he overheard two servants talking. "Did you hear?" One whispered. "Teiwo's little sister died last night. They say it was hunger." Adebowale felt like he had been struck by lightning. He remembered the young boy who had begged for help, the boy he had cruelly sent away. And now a child was dead because of his selfishness. Tears filled the king's eyes. He called for his advisors and declared, "From this day forward, no one in Ife shall go hungry. Open the royal granaries and distribute food to every family in need." The people were shocked. Was this the same greedy king they had known? But they didn't question their good fortune. Soon, the streets of Ife were filled with the smell of cooking fires and the sound of laughter. As for Adebowale, he found that helping others eased his own discomfort. He started visiting the villages, listening to the problems of his people. He even helped in the communal farms, his big belly wobbling as he worked. Soon as the 9th moon approached, Adebowale grew more and more anxious. What would happen when the time came? Would he really give birth? And if so, how? The whole kingdom held its breath, waiting to see what would happen. Some said the king would burst like a ripe fruit. Others thought he would lay an egg like a giant chicken. The palace was in an uproar, with midwives and doctors arguing about how to handle this unprecedented situation. As the days ticked by, Adebowale's fear grew. He paced the palace halls, muttering prayers to every god he could think of. "Please," he begged, "I've learned my lesson. I'll be a good king, I promise. Just don't let me die." And then, on the night of the full moon, it happened. Adebowale woke up in the middle of the night, his belly tight with pain. He cried out, and the palace erupted into chaos. Servants ran in all directions, shouting for help. The royal doctor rushed in, his face pale with fear. "It's time," he announced, his voice shaking. "The king is in labor." As Adebowale lay there, sweating and groaning, something unexpected happened. His huge belly began to shrink. It was as if all the air was being let out of a giant balloon. The king watched in amazement as his stomach grew smaller and smaller until it was back to its original size. But that wasn't all. As his belly shrank, something else grew. His heart, which had been as small and hard as a pebble, began to expand. It grew and grew until it filled his entire chest with warmth and compassion. Suddenly, Adebowale understood. This was the birth the gods had planned all along. Not a child of flesh and blood, but a rebirth of his own spirit. As the sun rose over Ife, the people gathered outside the palace, waiting for news. They expected to hear the cry of a baby. Instead, they saw their king walk out, his body back to normal but his face glowing with a new light. "My people," Adebowale called out, his voice filled with emotion. "I have been blind, but now I see. I have been deaf, but now I hear. From this day forward, I vow to be the king you deserve. No one in Ife will ever go hungry again. We will work together to build a kingdom where everyone prospers." The crowd was silent for a moment, then erupted in cheers. They could hardly believe their ears, but the sincerity in Adebowale's eyes was unmistakable. From that day on, Ife flourished. Under Adebowale's new leadership, the kingdom became known far and wide as a place of prosperity and kindness. The king worked alongside his people in the fields, shared meals with the poor, and listened to the concerns of even the smallest child. Teiwo, the boy whose plea had set this whole story in motion. Adebowale sought him out personally, apologizing for his past cruelty and offering to help his family. Teiwo grew up to become one of the king's most trusted advisors, always reminding him of the importance of compassion. As for the old woman who had comforted Teiwo, some say she was never seen again. but others insist that on quiet nights, they can hear her laughter on the wind, a reminder that the gods are always watching. Years later, when Adebowale was old and grey, something strange began to happen in Ife. Women who had struggled to have children suddenly found themselves pregnant. Barren fields burst into bloom. It was as if a wave of fertility had swept over the land. And at the center of it all was Adebowale. People noticed that plants seemed to grow faster in his presence. Animals flocked to him as if he were some kind of nature spirit. Children born in Ife during this time were said to be blessed with unusual wisdom and kindness. Whispers began to spread. Had the gods given Adebowale some sort of power? Was he more than just a man? The old king simply smiled when asked, saying only, "The greatest magic is the love we share with one another." But late at night, when the palace was quiet, some servants swore they could hear Adebowale talking to someone. They would peek into his chamber, only to find him alone, his hand resting on his belly as if remembering the strange burden he once carried.